A state-of-the-art aircraft, an experienced crew, a flight planned through the stars, yet in just 4 minutes everything changed. A cascade of failures, mechanical, human and systemic, plunged Flight 447 into the abyss. This is the story of a tragedy that shocked the world, a mystery buried in the deep, and the lessons that emerged from the wreckage forever changing how we fly. On the evening of May 31st, 2009, Air France Flight 447, an Airbus A330 registered as FGZ-CP, stood ready at Galeão International Airport in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. The flight was scheduled to carry 216 passengers and 12 crew members across the Atlantic to Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport. The aircraft, only 4 years old, was a modern twin-engine wide-body jet equipped with the state-of-the-art avionics and fly-by-wire technology. It had logged 18,870 flight hours and was considered one of the safest in its class. The passenger manifest was a diverse tapestry of humanity: business travelers, families, honeymooners, and students from 32 nationalities, including 61 French, 58 Brazilian, and 26 German citizens. The crew was led by Captain Marc Dubois, a 58-year-old veteran with 11,000 flight hours, including 1,700 on the A330. His co-pilots were First Officer David Robert, aged 37, with 6,547 hours, and First Officer Pierre Cedric Bonin, aged 32, with 2,936 hours. The cabin crew, experienced and well-trained, prepared for a routine overnight flight. The weather forecast for the route indicated challenges. The intertropical convergence zone, a band of thunderstorms near the equator, was active, with towering cumulonimbus clouds that could reach 50,000 feet. These storms were notorious for turbulence, icing, and lightning, but the A330 was designed to handle such conditions, and the crew had planned a route to minimize exposure. At 7:29 am local time, Flight 447 pushed back from the gate, taxied to runway 10, and lifted off into the Brazilian night, climbing to its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. For the first 2 hours, the flight proceeded uneventfully. The aircraft cruised at approximately 470 knots through the clear skies. Passengers settled in, some watching movies, others sleeping under blankets. The cabin crew served meals and dimmed the lights. In the cockpit, Captain Dubois and First Officer Bonin handled the initial phases, with Robert resting in the crew rest compartment, as was standard for long-haul flights to manage fatigue. At 1:35 am, Flight 447 entered the edge of the intertropical convergence zone. The crew had already adjusted their route slightly based on the weather radar, which showed clusters of thunderstorms ahead. The radar displayed green, yellow, and red patches indicating areas of increasing precipitation intensity. Dubois, monitoring the instruments, noted turbulence ahead and advised Bonin to keep the seatbelt sign on. The aircraft's weather radar, while advanced, had limitations. It could not detect the full extent of turbulence or icing within the clouds. At 1:48 am, the crew contacted Brazil Air Traffic Control at Recife, reporting their position over the Taysil waypoint, a virtual marker in the Atlantic about 565 miles from Fernando de Noronha, an archipelago of Brazil's coast. This was one of the last communications with air traffic control as the flight was approaching the Atlantic Gap, a region beyond radar coverage, where aircraft rely on satellite-based automatic dependent surveillance broadcast and aircraft communication addressing and reporting system to transmit data to ground stations. At 2:06 am, the aircraft entered a dense cluster of thunderstorms. The outside air temperature dropped and the crew noticed light turbulence. Unbeknownst to them, the aircraft's pitot tubes, small sensors on the fuselage that measure airspeed, began to ice cover. These tubes, manufactured by Thales, were known to be vulnerable to ice crystal accumulation in high-altitude thunderstorms, despite meeting certification standards. The icing caused inconsistent airspeed readings, an omission that had prompted Air France to begin replacing the Thales pitot tubes with a more robust model, though FGZ-CP had not yet been upgraded. At 2:10 am, the autopilot and auto thrust disengaged, triggered by the unreliable airspeed data. The aircraft's flight control system reverted to alternate law, a mode that reduces some of the A330's automatic protections, such as stall prevention. The cockpit filled with warning chimes. Bunning at the controls took manual command as trained. The aircraft was still at 35,000 feet, but the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Bunning, reacting to the sudden loss of automation, pulled back on his side stick, causing the aircraft to pitch up. The A330's fly-by-wire system, which interprets pilot inputs through computers, executed the command, increasing the angle of attack. The airspeed indicators showed conflicting readings. One momentarily dropped to 60 knots, far below the actual speed of 205 knots. Confused, Bunning continued to pull back, likely believing the aircraft was losing altitude or speed. By 2:10 am, the aircraft's angle of attack had increased to 16 degrees, well beyond the critical angle for a stall. The winds lost lift and the aircraft began to descend, though its nose remained pitched up. The stall warning blared, stall, stall, a synthetic voice triggered by the flight computers. However, the warning was intermittent, stopping when the airspeed readings became too low for system to process, only to resume as the readings fluctuated. This inconsistency likely confused the crew further. Captain Dubois, who had been resting, returned to the cockpit around 2:11 am, about a minute into the crisis. He found a chaotic scene. Bunning was pulling back on the side stick, Robert was calling out conflicting instructions, and the aircraft was descending at 2,000 feet per minute. The flight data recorder later showed the aircraft's vertical speed reached 11,000 feet per minute, with an angle of attack exceeding 40 degrees, an extreme aerodynamic state. Dubois asked, "What's happening?" Robert replied, "We have lost all control of the airplane." Bunning, still holding the side stick back, said, "I've got the controls." The crew did not realize the stall. The A330's flight envelope protections, designed to prevent stalls, were disabled in alternate law, and the pilots had not been trained extensively for high-altitude manual stall recovery. The standard procedure, push the nose down to reduce the angle of attack and regain lift, was not applied. As the aircraft plummeted, the crew struggled to interpret the flood of warnings and erratic instrument readings. The primary flight display showed a nose up altitude, but the altimeter was unwinding rapidly. At 2:12 am, Robert, realizing Bunning's inputs were worsening the situation, took his own side stick and pushed forward, briefly reducing the angle of attack. However, the A330's side stick system does not provide tactile feedback, and the inputs are summed algebraically. Bunning, unaware of Robert's action, continued pulling back, overriding the forward input. The aircraft descended through 20,000 feet, then 10,000 feet, still in a deep stall. Passengers strapped in or clinging to armsets experienced violent turbulence and G-forces. The cabin was filled with screams, prayers, and the roar of the storm outside. The flight attendants, trained for emergencies, could do little but brace themselves. At 2:14 am, the aircraft struck the Atlantic Ocean approximately 1,000 miles from the Brazilian coast near the St. Peter and St. Paul archipelago. The impact speed was 107 knots, about 123 miles per hour, with a vertical descent rate of 11,000 feet per minute and pitch altitude of 16.2 degrees nose up. The fuselage broke apart on impact and debris scattered across the surface. All 224 souls aboard perished instantly. Brazilian and French naval vessels, supported by aircraft, began searching on June 1st. Floating debris, seats, life vests, and fragments of the fuselage was spotted on June 6, along with 50 bodies. The recovery effort was grueling, hampered by deep waters and strong currents. The flight recorders critical to understanding the crash remained missing. The French Bureau of Inquiry and Analysis for Civil Aviation Safety led the investigation. Initial theories included terrorism, lightning, or structural failure, but the ACARS messages pointed to airspeed sensor issues. In April 2011, after extensive sonar searches, the wreckage was located. The cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder were recovered on May 1st and 2nd, 2011, remarkably intact. The flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder revealed the chilling sequence. The crash was not caused by a single failure, but a cascade of events. 1. The tail spitted tube's ice tower, causing unreliable airspeed readings and disengaging the autopilot. 2. Bunning's persistent nose-up inputs induced and maintained the stall. The crew failed to recognize the stall or apply recovery procedures. 3. Poor communication and coordination among the pilots exacerbated the crisis. Dubois did not take command decisively, and the dual side-stick inputs created confusion. 4. Air France's training did not adequately prepare pilots for high-altitude stalls or manual flying in alternate law. And 5. Fatigue, stress, and the cognitive overload from conflicting instruments impaired decision-making. The BEA's final report, published in July 2012, cited the combination of technical failure and human error. The pitted tube icing was the initial event, but the crew's response turned a recoverable situation into a catastrophe. The report also noted Air France's slow response to replace the tail's pitted tubes despite prior incidents. The story of Air France Flight 447 is a tragedy of technology and human fallibility. A routine flight undone by a fleeting sensor failure spiraled into a disaster through misjudgment and synthetic gaps. Yet from the depth of the Atlantic, the recovered black boxes spoke, guiding aviation toward a safer future. The passengers and crew forever lost remind us of the fragility of flight and the relentless pursuit of answers in the face of tragedy.